Thank you, Jason, for being our ancient ordo and calendar for the parish. The venerable tradition going back long before there was an internet to look up conveniently when these days fell on the calendar. Always the movable dates proclaimed on this great solemnity of the Epiphany of the Lord. So to grasp the significance of the Epiphany, for this is truly one of the pivot feasts of the entire liturgical year, we need to look back at what it's joined to, or what it's fulfilling, and that is the Advent journey. The word Advent is derived from adventus in Latin. Apontesis is the Greek, but that is a little less obvious. Adventus in Latin, meaning the ancient word they used for the ceremonial, the joyful ceremonial by which you received the emperor or the king to your city. And so Advent is literally, as we pray, preparing the way for the Lord. It's preparing for the reception of the king, both at his second coming, which is not yet fulfilled, and of course, setting the path for Christmas, the commemoration of us receiving our King as he comes into his creation, the Word made flesh. And so if that is the Adventus, then the Epiphany, epiphaneia in Greek, which is joined, the epi is upon, phaneia, to shine upon or appear, essentially when we take those together. So this feast that we celebrate today is the commemoration of something shining upon or something appearing. And this is the fulfillment of the Adventus, the appearing of the Lord, or even more appropriately, the appearance of the glory of the Lord, as the glory of the Lord shines upon the earth. And so some places early on in the church, Epiphany, in a confusing way, actually referred to the nativity of the Lord itself. So Epiphany was used as a word to describe Christmas. But in time, the Nativity of the Lord was its own celebration, and Epiphany gained this threefold meaning. Three feasts. If the Nativity of the Lord, if Christmas Day is the birth of Jesus, known by a few, the Epiphany commemorates the revealing of the newborn King to the nations. And so this was done in three ways, or commemorated in three ways. The arrival of the Magi, as we hear in today's gospel, the baptism of Jesus, in which the Father's voice announces that this is my beloved Son, and the wedding feast at Cana, where Jesus performs his first miracle, revealing his divine power. So this is the threefold mystery of the Epiphany. Now, fortunately for us, because that's so much to digest, we don't have to cover all that in one day anymore, for we get the gift of next Sunday, the Feast of the Baptism of the Lord, and then the following Sunday, the second Sunday in Ordinary Time, is always the reading of the wedding feast at Cana. So we'll have time for those latter two later. But what are we to do with this mysterious event of the Magi? Why does Matthew capture it when there's so many other details that Luke captures that Matthew doesn't, and yet Matthew makes a point to share this story of the arrival of these strangers? And to grasp the significance of this, we have to pay close attention to our other readings, particularly the first reading and the psalm. So the beginning of the first reading from Isaiah chapter 60 that we heard said, "Rise up in splendor, Jerusalem. Your light has come, the glory of the Lord shines upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick clouds cover the peoples. But upon you the Lord shines, and over you appears his glory. Nations shall walk by your light, and kings by your shining radiance. Raise your eyes and look about. They all gather and come to you." So these verses from Isaiah chapter 60, Trito Isaiah as we call it in the tradition, are written after the return of the Israelites from the Babylonian exile. Before the exile, the people, and particularly her rulers, had become corrupt and unfaithful to God, and so great calamity came by this. the exile brought ruin to everything. And in fact, many questioned their belief in the God of Israel. Now, God has freed them to return to their land, but he doesn't want them to return to their former ways that brought them ruin, but to return in a way according to his purpose as he intended his relationship with them all along, and the mission in particular that he had for his people all along. Israel is not meant to be a nation closed in on itself. But in fact, the first knee-jerk response of the people to look at how did things go so wrong was, well, we mixed with the other nations too much. And so it set upon this kind of what we might say is puritanical zeal to close and preserve all things explicitly Jewish. Well, that's good. In a lot of ways, that was fulfilling of the law given. But the problem was God didn't want a people closed in on themselves, but a people that would shine before the nations. A people to draw the nations to himself. Yes, God chose a holy people, but God chose a holy people to draw other peoples to himself as well. So Isaiah calls out for the nation to shine, that God shines his light upon them and shares his glory with her, and in turn this light will guide other nations to come to Israel. So when these three mysterious figures show up from the east in Jerusalem, asking about a newborn king of the Jews, there is a fulfillment of prophecy in progress. These magi, as they're known, are astrologers or astronomers. There was no distinction between those two things in the ancient world. And they're counted upon in the lands of the east and the north as wisdom figures. The majority of scholars have contended that they must have come from the northeast, from Persia, which would be modern-day Iran. This is because that's where the Magi originated from, as these figures. However, by that time, Magi and their role had spread throughout many of the different nations and cities of that region, and many make a compelling case that they were in fact from the Arabian Peninsula to the east. Some of those places that we hear in the first reading and the psalm that have no meaning to us as present-day people. These places, Sheba and Seba and Epha, places that are in modern-day Arabia, as far south as Yemen. So, if they were from the Arabian Peninsula, it would be all the more fitting. They would be literally coming from these places that were named. But in any case, whether they're from the east, the northeast, they come from outside of Israel. These non-Jews have seen in the stars a sign of great import for the Jewish people, that a special king is born, and they come to pay him homage. Now, the recipient of this news is King Herod the Great, as he was ironically called. King Herod was a tyrant, and he was also an impostor king. He was not of the lineage of the kings of Israel, but was installed by the Romans as a client king in the region. And King Herod, long before these visitors showed up, had quite the reputation for being willing to kill anything in his way. King Herod had killed his children, his wives, anyone he deemed to pose a threat to his power were quickly dispatched. And so Herod is alarmed at any talk of a new king, especially one that could possibly be the so-called Christ. The chief priests and the scribes rightfully point to Bethlehem as the prophesied place for the coming of the Messiah, and so the Magi resume their journey under the sign of this mysterious star that seems to defy physics. Many have made compelling scientific cases to explain the star, and some of them are quite fascinating if you're into astronomy. But no matter what the cause of the star in the heavens, there seems to be little doubt that there was something of the supernatural involved with it. After all, no star, no matter how good you are at navigating by the stars, they can't lead you to a house. This isn't like a pin on Google Maps, and yet the star is able to lead them to this house in Bethlehem. They come, they find the wondrous newborn king, and these foreigners, again, not of the children of Israel, prostrate themselves before him and offer these treasures of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Many symbolic explanations have been given for these wonderful gifts. Gold befitting a royal person, frankincense befitting of a priest, and myrrh, one that will die. But frankincense and gold are also, if you notice, mentioned as a pairing in our first reading, as when the nations will come, the camels, the dromedaries, bringing gifts of frankincense and gold. And frankincense and myrrh are mentioned together only once in the Old Testament in the Song of Songs as a royal wedding gift, very fitting for the bridegroom who has arrived. So all of this sets up what's going on in this passage. But as people a couple thousand years later, what are our takeaways? What are we to do with the significance of this feast? That we say that the glory of God has shone upon us or been revealed. And I'll offer you two takeaways today. The first is the gathering of nations. Although the Messiah is the long expected one by the people of Israel, they are not the first to notice his coming. It's foreigners from the east who come to do him homage. And so despite the waiting and the anticipation, they don't notice when he arrives. But with their arrival, the arrival of the Magi, the Gentiles have come to Israel, following a divine light to see the light which has come into the world. In the second reading, Paul speaks of the mystery made known to me by revelation, not made known to people in other generations, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit, that the Gentiles are co-heirs, members of the same body, and co-partners in the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel. Paul is making clear here the meaning of this, that with the arrival of the Magi, the Gentiles have come to see Jesus as well. This is the fulfillment of the prophecies, not just for the Jewish people, but that the Christ comes to gather all into the family of the Lord. And for us, this is highly significant. I would guess that the majority of us present here do not have any Jewish ethnicity to us. And yet, the good news has been shared to the ends of the earth, and we have all been invited into the family of God. This is a big deal. God desires all the nations to be gathered into his flock. This is also the foundation and why we need to be careful with some of the errors of Zionism, especially those amongst, I'll say a lot of them amongst more Protestant Christians, but also some Catholic Christians as well, who fail to see that there's a distinction between Zion and its symbolic significance and the reality of the present-day city and the place. Because we've come to understand that the new Jerusalem, the new Israel, is to be found in the church. It's not that all of us are grafted or transfused with Jewish blood, but in fact that the new Jerusalem has been expanded. It stands for something greater than a fixed location, but in fact God's family and God's place where he is to be found has become universal. And so, after the Great Commission, Jesus will send his apostles out to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, to gather all into the fold. And that's why we have great reverence for the Jewish people, and from a geopolitical standpoint, the handling and the United States alliance with Israel and all that's very important. but we have to keep the matters of the present-day politics and the religious ramifications very distinct. The fulfillment of God's prophecy is to be found in the church as the gospel has come to the peoples of all the earth. Here, the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, stands as a mysterious embodiment of this great reality as the Queen Mother, the type for Israel and the church itself as she receives these visitors. So if my first takeaway is the gathering of the nations, the great news that salvation has come to us, the second concerns the response or lack thereof. We see that the Magi bring gifts. They bring their adoration, they bring their homage. Herod brings fear, trembling, rage, murderous intent. There's no room for Herod for one that would upset the status quo. Go find him so that I too may do him homage. The holy innocents, the children murdered at his command, once he finds out that the Magi did not come back to him, represent all the children and innocents, born and unborn, who have suffered or been slain in the name of greed or selfishness, indifference, or haughtiness. Herod here represents an unresponsive world, the world that rejects the light coming into it. That same voice of the world will cry out and spur others to cry out years later, "Let him be crucified." And so, if we have two models, that of the Magi, that of Herod and the world, what is our response to be? Homage, indifference, rejection? How about gold, our material generosity to the church and those in need? How about prayer and thanksgiving rising like clouds of incense before God? How about the myrrh of self-mortification as we adopt new practices to die to our own selfishness and pride and sin, to follow God more closely in charity and truth? How about a home that is open to him? As you leave Mass today, you'll have the opportunity to pick up the Advent home blessing kits. A home blessed and chalked, showing that this household and all who live in it belong to the household of the Lord. Will we make our homes places of welcome? Will we bring him a heart that is vulnerable like his and open to the wonder of the mystery of his presence, of his epiphany? Then you shall be radiant at what you see. Your heart shall throb and overflow, for the riches of the sea shall be emptied out before you. Indeed, the words of Isaiah are fulfilled, and today we recognize that the light has come into the world and that the darkness cannot conquer it. We have received the best of all the gifts that God has to offer, himself, in the fullness of love. Indeed, our light has come, and the glory of the Lord shines upon us.